This lecture focuses on developmentally appropriate practice and how it's used with young children. Before we start digging into the details of developmentally appropriate practice, or DAP, it's important to give a basic definition. So this definition comes from NAEYC. So we'll kind of move through this definition and break it down a little bit. So NAEYC defines developmentally appropriate practice as methods that promote each child's optimal learning and development through a strengths-based, play-based approach to joyful, engaged learning. So one critical piece of developmentally appropriate practice, which we will come back to at the end of this lecture, is that we look at children as being capable and resilient and strong and interested in learning. So rather than coming at childhood from a deficit point of view where we assume that children don't have the skills, strengths, and abilities that they need, that they're not interested in learning, and that we have to do something to make them grow and develop and be interested in the learning process. That's not what DAP is. DAP assumes that children are interested and engaged and are coming into the world with marvelous skills and abilities, and it's our job just to facilitate that. Also very heavily focused on play, which again we'll come back to at the end. So the appropriate learning for young children up through about age 8 is some form of play, some form of hands-on, active engagement, playful, enjoyable learning. So to do this, educators implement developmentally appropriate practice by recognizing the multiple assets or strengths of young children and look at them as unique individuals and members of families and communities. So it's really important to remember the child themselves, but also the family and community that they exist in, because humans don't exist in vacuums. So in developmentally appropriate practice, we build on each child's strengths. We take care not to harm any aspect of each child's physical, cognitive, social, or emotional well-being. So a goal of developmentally appropriate practice is the whole child. So thinking about every facet of the child, their academic learning, their social emotional learning, their physical learning, and making sure that we attend to all of these different domains and that we're not doing damage to any domains by virtue of choices we make in the educational process. So we'll be talking about that at the end of the lecture, that there is evidence to show that there are particular ways to educate young children that have the most advantageous outcomes for them and do our best not to harm them. So in light of this, in keeping the whole child in mind and helping to facilitate their development in the most efficacious way possible, educators design and implement learning environments to help all children achieve their full potential across all domains of development and all content areas. So domains of development are those things I was just talking about: social, emotional, language, cognitive, physical. And content areas are the more traditional school subjects: social studies, the sciences, the arts, language and literacy, mathematics or numeracy. So we're focusing on all of those things in the most developmentally appropriate way possible. So developmentally appropriate practice recognizes and supports each individual as a valued member of the learning community. Everybody matters. Everybody comes with skills and strengths and abilities, and everyone deserves to have the best possible educational environment for themselves. So as a result, to be developmentally appropriate, practices must be culturally, linguistically, and ability appropriate for each child. So we're going to be talking about position statements on this slide, and the reason that we're talking about position statements is that NAEYC has developed a position statement related to developmentally appropriate practice that we're going to be digging into in this lecture. And so I want to make sure that you understand what a position statement is before we move on to talking about that particular position statement. So a position statement or a position paper is something that says that there is an issue and that that issue should be handled in a particular way. So it is making a definitive statement about how something in the world should work and providing background and data and research and a rationale for why that particular position is being taken. So in the case of developmentally appropriate practice, NAAYC is saying exactly what I said to you in the previous slide, that we need to pay attention to the whole child, that we need to consider children to be strong, resilient, and ready to learn, that we need to engage in play-based learning with them, that we need to be individually, culturally, and developmentally appropriate in the work that we're doing. But they don't just say that, they give evidence for why that's the case. And so they publish a book, a developmentally appropriate practice book, that is their position statement. And occasionally they revise it, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. But that position statement very definitively lays out how early education should operate and why it should operate in that way. So I would encourage you to also look at the little study.com lesson on this slide so that you have a better understanding of what a position statement is. And then you can also take a look at the link related to NAAYC, because NAAYC actually has lots of position statements, and we're going to be using those position statements for an assignment that you have in class. They have statements on how to behave ethically and what college programs should look like, what teachers should be engaging in, along with developmentally appropriate practice. But for this lecture, we're just going to focus on the DAP position statement. So as I noted, one of the position statements that has been created by NAAYC is related to developmentally appropriate practice. You can find the link to that position statement on this slide. But we're going to walk through what that book suggests. So first, we're going to talk about the history of revisions that have been made to this document since it was first published, and then we're going to go into all the different bits and pieces that are in the position statement so that you have a better understanding of what that document contains. So let's start by talking about the history of DAP. So again, NAAYC created a position statement in the form of a book that outlines what is considered to be evidence-based practice for young children. So the kinds of practices that should be used with young children based on research data and evidence. And so the first issue, or the first edition of the DAP book, came out in the mid-1980s. And so what was happening at that time is there was a report released more generally related to education called A Nation at Risk, and it pretty much said that education in the United States was not doing a good job and that there needed to be more accountability for teachers in what they were teaching children, even young children, and that there needed to be standards so that we could determine what children were learning and how that learning was going to happen. And an unfortunate outcome of this document was that education became very academic and very pushed down, so that things that kids were doing in first grade dropped down to kindergarten and then dropped down to preschool. And the stakes got really high. And rather than sort of considering what children's developmental abilities were, we were kind of pushing very young children very hard to learn very academic content and to sit still at desks and to do many, many worksheets. And so school became very academic, and play and learning more authentically through hands-on active engagement kind of went to the back burner. And as we're going to talk about at the end of this lecture, there's some research to show that that really was not a good idea, particularly for young children. Remember when we said part of the position statement is not to do any harm? Well, unfortunately, early academics does seem to do some harm, and the bummer is you don't really get academic benefits. So it's not like the benefit is outweighing the risk, because you're not getting any greater academic benefit than you did through more hands-on play-based learning. So another thing that was also happening is that NAAYC as an organization was moving towards accreditation, which we've talked about in previous lectures. So this notion that there are benchmarks that programs can try to achieve that demonstrate that they are meeting quality standards. So it was important to have a document that said, hey, here are the quality standards, so that when people were trying to get accredited, the whole field was kind of speaking the same language. So that's where the impetus for the original document came from. And so a big part of what it focused on was looking at things that were considered to be appropriate practice and things that were considered to be inappropriate practice based on children's age and needs. So for example, an appropriate practice with infants and toddlers would be lots of time to play independently with activities with adults with them, not having very long extended circle times. Inappropriate practice with infants and toddlers would be to have them all doing the same activity at the same time, sitting in circle time for 20 minutes. We know that these things aren't really within the developmental capability of infants and toddlers and wouldn't be considered appropriate. So that was a big piece of the first document, was sort of this dichotomy between what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. So that document was around for about 10 years. It was actually referred to as the Green Bible because it was green. The cover of the book was green, and it was considered to be like the definitive, most important document for early childhood education and thinking about how we do our work. So in the mid-1990s, some folks said, hey, this is great. It's great that we're outlining what good practices with young children are and what's potentially the best way to go about things, but the role of culture is really not in here at all. So right now you're really only talking about, what children need in terms of age. So what 2-year-olds need, what 3-year-olds need, what 6-year-olds need, and also pairing that with what individual children might need. So maybe a child with disabilities or a child who speaks another language, but it's not really considering the role of culture, because culture is a context within which children sit. So children don't just come to a classroom and what happens in their day-to-day lives doesn't matter. They come from various cultures and backgrounds and ways of doing things, and that wasn't really considered. So maybe a child is indigenous, comes from a Native American or Indian culture, and it is, in the United States, we're much more individualistic. For indigenous cultures, oftentimes they're much more collective. So maybe there are ways of navigating learning and activities in a culture that's more collective versus a culture that's more individualistic. And we're not really accounting for that in the document. So in the 1990s, there was a revision to the document. So that's when the second edition came out, that recognized more explicitly the role of culture and how that might change or permeate the child's experience, and that we needed to have a broader understanding of what developmentally appropriate practice might be, still keeping it more play-based and child-initiated, but recognizing the role of culture as being important. And then there was another revision in the mid-2000s, so about 10 years again after that. And this revision was really, again, like coming in with this strong stance of play is important, child-directed learning is important, because there was a lot of stuff happening in the 2000s, kind of like happened in the mid-80s, where those standards that we were kind of inching towards with children, not the NAAYC quality standards, but standards for children and what they're supposed to learn, that came to the forefront. We started doing a lot of high stakes testing, and that was getting pushed down to younger and younger grades. which high stakes testing is not recommended until children are in like 8 or in 3rd grade. A lot of people were very worried that kids weren't ready for kindergarten, so we wanted to push when they were in preschool and do all kinds of like heavy duty academic stuff with them. So there was a lot happening in the 2000s that was kind of reminiscent of what happened in the 80s. So DAP came in even stronger with research related to the detriments of a high stakes academic environment for young children and the importance of a play-based environment instead. And then on the next slide, we're going to talk about the most recent revision. So we're on revision 4 currently. So about 6 years ago, we had another revision of the DAP book. It is not green anymore. It is now blue. You can see the cover of the most recent edition on the right of this slide. And this one it leveled up on a few things. So one, it gave more attention to infants and toddlers. So as we've discussed before, early childhood education is birth through age 8. So there was not as much attention originally in the earlier versions of this position statement on the youngest children. So there's more attention given to the youngest children in this document. Something that they're trying to encourage is, for a long time, early childhood has been pushed down upon. So elementary schools keep pushing their curriculum down on us. And so what this document is doing is saying, no, we need to go the other direction. We need to push our curriculum up to you. So that those early elementary school grades, so transitional kindergarten, and grades 1 through 3, does more of what we do and less of what elementary schools do to be more appropriate, because we know that young children learn better through play and more active hands-on learning. So trying to get more of that push up rather than push down. A big part here is DIP has always recognized that individual children have individual skills and abilities, and that children from different cultures may come with different ways of doing things. But in previous versions of the document, that was always kind of a deficit approach, like something that we need to fix or something that we need to consider and then give kids something that they're missing. And so this document does a much better job of recognizing that whatever children are coming with is a strength and an ability to be celebrated and incorporated rather than repaired. And in keeping with that, another part of this is really thinking about how when we have this sort of deficit approach, when we employ isms, so when we employ ableism, which is thinking that people who are able-bodied are better than people who have disabilities, when we employ racism, languageism, where we think that English is the best language and others are lesser than languages, when we employ sexism, when we treat boys differently than we do girls, when we consider people of lower SES to be less than folks who have higher income. So all of those isms. This document directly recognizes and addresses the fact that those isms harm children and people, that they're not productive, that they don't recognize people's strengths and abilities. So really getting away from using a deficit approach and employing a strengths-based approach. The DAB document contains 3 primary components, and we're going to be going over these components on the next slide. So one is called Core Considerations to Inform Decision Making. That will be our first slide after this one. Then we're going to talk about Principles of Child Development and Learning, which is really about what developmental skills children have and how those should inform the work that we do with them. The next piece that we're going to talk about is elements of developmentally appropriate practice, and there's a bunch of those, so that's going to take 5 or 6 slides to get through that. And just again, we'll be talking about all of these components on the following set of slides.
The basic premise of developmentally appropriate practice is that our practice with young children should be developmentally appropriate, so it should be based on what children at particular ages are able to do. It should be individually appropriate. It should always be focused on what an individual child can do, regardless of their age, because we know that sometimes a 3-year-old can't necessarily do 3-year-old things, or sometimes a 3-year-old is able to do 5-year-old things. So in addition to paying attention to developmental skills, we also have to pay attention to individual skills. Finally, developmentally appropriate practice needs to be culturally appropriate. So we need to pay attention to what children are able to do in the context of their families, the societies that they live in. So 3 things. We need to be individually, developmentally, and culturally appropriate.
So on this slide and the next 2, we're going to be talking about principles of child development and learning. So again, this is thinking about what we know about young children's development, which is why if you're going to work with young children, you need to take courses that talk about developmental milestones and how children grow and learn, so that you can take that information and apply it to your work with young children. It's virtually impossible to work effectively with young children if you don't understand them first and understand particular things about how they grow and change across time. So these principles are related to that piece of things. So the first principle, and we're going to be talking about 9 different principles. So there's 3 on this slide, 3 on the next, and 3 on the slide after that. So the first one here is that development and learning is dynamic. So basically that means that kids don't stay the same, that they change across time. So a baby doesn't look the same as a toddler, and a toddler doesn't look the same as a preschooler, and a preschool doesn't look the same as a school-age child. And how that change happens is a relationship between the child's environment and just internal biological processes. So children come into the world with skills and abilities that change across time as they grow, but how that change and growth across time happens depends on the culture that they exist in. So the neighborhood that they grow up in, the family that they grow up in, the school that they have access to, the friends that they have, all of these things work in concert with the child's biological characteristics. So the next one, all domains of child development, physical, cognitive, social and emotional, and linguistic, which means language development, as well as approaches to learning, so how interested children are in the learning process, are important. So these are all interrelated. So they all matter and they're all interrelated. That's why in developmentally appropriate practice, we focus on the whole child, because we recognize that a child is not just a physical being, a child is not just a social being, a child is not just an emotional being, they are a whole child, a whole being. And so it's important for us to help develop all of these different developmental selves, not just one, and that they're all connected to each other. That if a child is not socially and emotionally healthy, they're probably not going to have an approach to learning. They're probably not going to be interested in school. They're not going to think very well. If they're not physically capable, they may not feel good about themselves. So everything matters all together. The third one here on this slide is that play promotes joyful learning that fosters children's development. So play is essential. So this is not just an opinion. This is based on who children are as developmental beings. So when you take child development classes, one of the things that you learn is how children explore and learn about the world and make sense of the world and make connections about concepts and ideas is done by touching things, by observing things, by playing with things, by interacting with other people while they're playing with things. So play isn't just something fun that makes learning cute or enjoyable. It does make learning fun and it does make learning enjoyable, but it makes it fun and enjoyable because that's how children learn best. That is the best match to their developmental skills and abilities, which is why they shouldn't be sitting still for long periods of time. They shouldn't have people directly teach them things while they just listen and don't do. They shouldn't be sitting at desks doing worksheets for hours and hours because that's not a good developmental match for how they learn and grow. So the principles on this slide are, again, there's 3 of them. So the first one is, although general progressions of development and learning can be identified, there is variation and individual difference must be considered. So there are developmental milestones. We talked about those in one of our earlier lectures. So we have a sense of what children do at particular times and ages. So we have a general sense of what many 2-year-olds do, what many 4-year-olds do, etc. But there's always individual variation. So some children walk early and some children walk late. I walked at 8 months. My mother, I think, was horrified that I walked so early, which isn't typical. Usually walking comes more about age 1. Some children talk early. My daughter was saying things, had like 300 words that she could say by the time she was just over 1, which is fairly atypical. My son didn't really say a whole lot for a while, but he was super advanced in terms of his physical skills. He was doing things physically that an older child should be able to do. So children may be exactly on time, they may be behind, they may be ahead, but it's really important to know that all children have some sort of individual variation. So this is what I was talking about on the last slide, and why play is relevant is because children are active learners from birth. They are noticing things in the world, they are trying to interact with things in the world, they are curious, they want to learn, they're making connections, they ask questions, and this happens best through interactions with the environment, touching, doing, interacting with others, having conversations with other people. So those experiences and environments and what kinds of experiences and environments those are is vitally important. And the last one, when children feel connected. So we're going to talk later in this about relationships in this lecture, but I'm bringing it up again later because it's so vitally important. But when children are connected, when they feel important, when they feel that things are meaningful, when they feel that people care about them, then they have greater purpose and they learn better. So when we feel better, we learn better. When we feel better, we're more motivated. When we feel better, we have more agency. So this is very important for young children as well. The principles included in this current iteration of the DAP book are these 3. So 1, that children learn in sort of an integrated way. So the idea here is that we need to create a foundation and then we build off of that foundation. So, you know, that old adage that you don't teach a child to run before they can walk. They need to build the skills of standing, walking, and then running, and then doing things while they're running. Same thing when we talk about academic subjects. First we learn letters, then we learn sounds, then we learn how to put them together, then we're reading whole sentences, then we're reading whole books. So it's really important as educators to understand skills that come before, during an age period, and after, so that we know where we're building towards. That's where those milestones become important, so that we can think about, if a child is currently doing this, here's where they're going to be going next. If you understand sort of that building of milestones and skills and abilities across both academic subjects and developmental domains, you'll have a better chance of doing the second bullet on this slide, which is helping children to practice skills that they're currently exhibiting, but also providing opportunities and challenging children to start working on the next skills coming down the line. If you don't know that children run after they walk, you may not provide opportunities for them to run. If you don't know that children start reading books after they start reading sentences, you may fail to give them books to read. So always good to know how we can help children to achieve mastery in the place that they're at and how we can challenge them to start building skills that are going to be next down the line. The final piece here is about technology. So I have many other lectures that I do on technology. I'm not saying just plunk children down in front of the TV or their screens. There is not really any data that shows that that's helpful or useful except in very minimal amounts for young children. But it does not mean that technology cannot be a valuable tool. There are many things that we can look up and learn about. Children can use cameras. They can create PowerPoint presentations. Again, we're talking about early elementary school as well. So using technology and media in a way that furthers children's learning goals and helps them to be interactive and hands-on rather than passive viewers of screens. So passive viewing of screens, not something that we want to support or encourage, but interactive use of technology and media, yes, can be very helpful to children's development. So next, we've talked about the core considerations and we've talked about the principles. So now we're going to talk about the practice and action elements. So the DAP in action elements, and there are 6 of them. So we're going to talk about creating a caring, equitable community of learners. We're going to talk about engaging in reciprocal partnerships with families and fostering community connections. We're going to talk about observing, documenting, and assessing children's development and learning, teaching to enhance each child's development and learning, planning and implementing an engaging curriculum to achieve meaningful goals, and finally, demonstrating professionalism as an early childhood educator. So I just want to give a heads up. I'm not going to talk a lot about each one of these slides because these are things we're going to be coming back to in upcoming lectures. So these different elements are going to be reflected in future class sessions. So we'll talk more about observation and assessment. We're going to talk a lot about how to create engaging, meaningful curriculum. We're going to talk about families. So you're going to see all of these things reflected in later lectures. So we're just going to give them a brief introduction this go around. The first practice element to discuss is creating a caring, equitable community of learners. So this again is related to the notion of relationships, which is so vital and important that I'm going to actually talk about it at the end of this lecture as well, not just here in the elements, but to really emphasize its importance for young children. But kind of as a beginning here, these are the components of this particular element. So first, important to recognize that every member of the community is valued by everyone, so that children value each other, adults value children, children value adults, that everyone is seen as capable and perfect in their own way, so that we're not looking at people as being less than or more than or better than, but everyone is coming as a valued member who brings strengths, abilities, and something worth paying attention to and creating a relationship with. So there's also a recognition, this is the second piece, that educators are in the driver's seat when it comes to creating these relationships. So it's not the child's job to create a relationship with us. It's our job to create a relationship with them. And it's not their job to be responsible for creating relationships with each other. It's our job to help them create relationships with each other. So as an adult human in the room with more advanced skills and abilities, the responsibility for those relationships lies with us. That we are all a learning community. This is the third one. So every member is accountable 4, treating others with kindness and respect and in ways that help everyone to learn and grow. So children are responsible for this, but only with our help. So we are primarily, again, responsible for this. And it's our job to help teach children how to interact with each other in ways that are respectful and create community. So if we see children doing things that are unfriendly to someone else, we guide them and teach them and help them to grow in considering um, alternative, more efficacious ways of interacting with each other. But we are a community. We need to act like a community, and adults are primarily responsible for making that happen. So the fourth one is creating a physical environment that protects the health and safety of everyone. So thinking about how we organize the room, think about how we set up our schedule, think about the kinds of activities that we put out. Think about including a calm down corner when things are overwhelming. Think about controlling the noise level. Think about keeping campuses safe so that drugs and dangerous people aren't allowed to have access. So it's our job as adults to think about how to create the best possible environment where then we can all relax and feel safe and have the best possible interactions and learning experiences. So finally, we make every effort that we possibly can that each and every member, and this is children, staff, teachers, families, other people who are entering our space, that we help them to feel both physically safe and psychologically safe, because when we have that safety, that's when we can do our best learning.
The next guideline or element is engaging in reciprocal partnerships with families and fostering community connections. So when we discuss families upcoming, we'll be digging into this more, but you can see that it is the notion of having respectful, reciprocal relationships with and among families, making sure families have ample opportunities to collaborate with facilities, to participate in their children's education and development, making sure that families have choice and that we're being sensitive to their preferences and needs, and involving families, making sure we recognize that they are their child's primary caregiver and that they are a valuable resource to tap into.
So this practice element is about the importance of observing, documenting, and assessing children's learning and development. So we're going to talk a little bit at the end about something called intentional teaching and how important it is, but this is a big part of what intentional teaching is about. So you should not just be randomly saying, oh, I'm going to put out this activity today and I don't really know why I'm putting it out or what purpose it serves or how it's going to help children grow and develop. Or I just grabbed this book off the shelf and I'm going to do circle time without really having thought through ahead of time about why you're doing the things that you're doing. So again, we're going to talk about this notion of being intentional, but it really comes down to planning and thinking ahead of time about what you would like to do. And the best way to plan and think ahead of time about what you would like to do is to have data to think and plan with. So it's really important to observe children, to see how they're playing, how they're growing, how they're interacting with others, to document the results of that observation, and then to assess what we need to do next, to think about what children are able to do, what maybe they need to work on a little bit more, and how we can use that data for creating curriculum, organizing our classrooms, thinking about how we can interact with young children. So it should all be data driven. I hope that you take from this class that early childhood education is not just something that we do because we think that's the best way to do it. We do what we do because it's based on research and data and evidence. And part of that research and data and evidence comes from the children themselves in the individual classrooms that you're teaching so that you can make the best decisions in that little micro environment of your classroom based on the data you've collected. So we want to make sure that we're regularly assessing children, that we're being reflective about the assessment that we collect, that we're using it to help drive children's developmental progress and our goals and objectives for them, that the assessments that we use are reflective of the age and abilities of the children in our care, that they are culturally relevant, that they are allowing individual children to shine. So we really need to think about what tools we're using and how to best use them to make sure that we're getting the best data for all children, that we're not using assessments that were not intended for the age or the developmental ability of the child. So earlier I said that standardized or high stakes tests should not be used with young children because it's not developmentally appropriate. So it wouldn't be appropriate to take one of those tests and then give it to young children just because. We want to make sure that the assessments we're using were designed and vetted on the samples of children that we're using them with. We also want to be careful about making really high stakes decisions. So keeping a child out of a program, referring to special ed, like the kind of assessment that we as general practitioners of early childhood can do cannot tell us those kinds of things. If we think those kinds of things are necessary, then we need to refer the child to an agency or a person that is able to do that more serious kind of assessment that can lead to placements or interventions. So let's say that you think you have a child with special needs, you might want to refer them to Inland Regional Center or to their school district, depending on their age, to get formally assessed, and then that assessment can be used for those kinds of more serious decisions. And so again, that's not our purpose. Our purpose is to do kind of simple classroom observation that helps us to drive general learning goals, general curricular kinds of activities, and more serious stuff should be left to professionals with more expertise and training than we typically have.
The next guideline is teaching to enhance each child's development and learning. So this is really getting to know children, making sure that we are providing them with the best instructional approaches, that we are scaffolding them in the best way possible, that we are using a wide range of teaching strategies and approaches to make sure that we really are meeting the needs of each and every child. We should be thinking carefully about what children's individual goals are, what their families' goals are for them, and engaging in teaching practices that make it possible for that child to reach those goals and those milestones.
So this next element is about how to plan effective curriculum so that it's engaging to young children and meaningful to the learning needs that they have at particular ages and developmental stages. So when we're thinking about appropriate curriculum, these are the things that we're going to keep in mind. And again, we're going to be coming back to curriculum and talking about this more extensively later on. But that one, we are using that observation and assessment data that we collected earlier to create learning goals. That's part of being intentional in our teaching, is to use data that we collect to have learning goals, learning ideas, so things that we want children to get from our activities and opportunities that will help them developmentally and also be responsive to their cultural, linguistic, and ability needs. So goals and objectives sometimes are for the whole class, sometimes they are for individual children. That we are addressing all developmental domains and all academic subject areas in our work. So we are creating and planning activities and learning opportunities that meet children's social, emotional, cognitive, language, and physical selves, but that they also address numeracy, literacy, language, the arts, science, social studies, etc. So we want to make sure that we're doing both developmental domains and academic subject areas. When we are creating our activities and experiences that we are sort of thinking about it as a big package. So unlike school where kids are, they're in writing, they're doing language arts for 1 hour and then they're doing math for another hour and there's really not any connection. We want to make sure that all of the activities we're planning have connectivity and that we're crossing boundaries in terms of multiple domains and academic disciplines, that we're not separating out the subjects and only working on one thing at one time. We want to make sure that the learning experiences that we provide are meaningful and relevant to young children. So young children should not be learning about, this is what Dewey talked about when we talked about Dewey earlier, that things should be meaningful. So young children shouldn't be learning about ancient Egypt. They should be learning about their neighborhood and their families and their school. And as they get older, then we learn about things that are farther flung and not so directly related to their personal life experience. Educators collaborate with each other. So this is why we're now saying, hey, let's stop being pushed down to. Let's go meet elementary school people, talk about the work we do, help it to be more of a two-way street. We push up rather than just being pushed down to, that there's better transitions for children among different educational contexts. So it's not dramatically different when they go to elementary school, that there's a progression of how education changes across time and we're all talking to each other so that it's a better experience for young children. And that even though it may be a very loose plan, part of being intentional is having a plan, writing down what curriculum you're using, writing down what activities you're planning on doing, what your circle times are going to consist of, what your schedule is going to look like, so that it's not just happenstance and you're not just coming up with it in the moment. You have a thoughtful plan that you're hoping to execute each day, with flexibility, of course, because we always need to be flexible with young children. So finally, the last element of practice that's important to pay attention to is being professional as an educator. So we already talked a little bit about this previously, but these are things that help people to be professionals. One is education. So there is definitive data and research to show that when teachers have a background, an educational background in early childhood, that it matters, that they do better in working with young children. And this is not necessarily true of experience. I think people think that experience is kind of the mark of a good teacher, but if you didn't know how to do it to start with, even if you've been doing it 30 years, if you're doing it 30 years not in the best way, that's 30 years of experience not in the best way. So we definitely want to promote education, particularly education related to infants and toddlers, because that's been found to be particularly important, that if you're going to work with the youngest children, that you have education related to educating the youngest children. But education for all early educators is important. And it's also important for that education to continue across time, so that not just are we getting education in school before we become a teacher, but you're also getting continual training after you have become an educator, after you've received your formal education, that you have in-service activities that you can go to, that you go to trainings on your own, that you keep taking courses, that you read materials from reputable sources. So continuing that education across the balance of your career is also important, so that when we learn new things about how we should be doing things, that you know how to do those. So one example is trauma-informed care. In the last 10 years, we've learned a lot about how to work with children who've experienced trauma. And a lot of that is related to what we now know about brain development and neurological development for children who've experienced trauma. So it's really important for us to know that kind of data and know what the best trauma-informed care practices are, so that we can do those things. But if we stopped our education 20 years ago and haven't been doing continual training, we wouldn't know any of this stuff. So it would be great. I know this isn't always, easily allowable at centers because typically you're with children all day. But if we really wanted teachers to be at their best, we would give them reflection and planning time. We would give them an hour a day of paid work where they could be in an office and plan for the next day and go into, collect data on the children and analyze that data and think about what it means and think about what goals and objectives they're developing and how they can implement those in their curriculum. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen, but that is definitely something that we should do if we want people to be able to be better practitioners and more professional in their work. And then finally, another thing that's really important is helping people to stay. So unfortunately, in early childhood, staff turnover is pretty high. A lot of people come and go, and not really good for children. So you can see here, there's an estimate. This is an older estimate, but I don't think it's changed, that about a third of the workforce every year in early childhood leaves, and then new people are coming in. So again, if we had planning time, if we paid people better, if we had better benefits, if we had more support in classrooms, these would be the kinds of things that would help folks to stay, because it's hard work. It's wonderful, meaningful, joyful work, but it is also hard work to be with young children all day. And so if we could give people more supports, they'd be much more likely to hang in there, which would be good for them, it would be good for the profession, and it would be good for children. So I was saying that the first edition of Developmentally Appropriate Practice that NAAYC published talked about appropriate versus inappropriate practice, and kind of had this dichotomy of these things are appropriate and these things are inappropriate, and that's become more fuzzy kind of across time. But there has been research on elements of practice that are considered to be appropriate versus elements that are considered to be inappropriate. So appropriate is typically referred to as DAP, developmentally appropriate practice, and things that are considered to be more inappropriate are sometimes referred to as DIP, developmentally inappropriate practice. And again, it's not that hard of a continuum, but I do want you to know that things that are considered to be developmentally appropriate do have research data to support that. And things that we do not recommend with young children, sitting still all day and doing a lot of seat work and rote learning where you're not actively engaged in doing things that are meaningful. You're sitting there filling out a worksheet like the child in the bottom right of the screen. That does not have as good of developmental outcomes as things that are child-initiated, active learning, teacher facilitation rather than teacher direct instruction. So here's some of the things that we do know. So we know that when kids go to classrooms in preschool and kindergarten that are using what's considered to be inappropriate practices, that they have higher stress. And that when children are in those kinds of classrooms where they're doing things that are more inappropriate, that they also have less motivation. So they're not really getting any academic benefit. They don't do better on math and reading and writing, but they do worse on motivation and social emotional things like stress. So we're not really getting any bang for our buck, and we're potentially doing harm to other developmental areas when we use less appropriate practices. Now, on the flip side, kids who are in preschool and kindergarten classrooms that use more appropriate practices, they show increased language ability, early literacy ability, mathematic ability, social ability. They have better self-regulation and something called executive function, which means that you are planning things that you need to do. So like, I want to build a block tower. I need to go find this set of blocks. Then I need to sit and not move a whole lot so that I can build this block tower. So being able to sort of think ahead about strategies that you need to employ and how to best make things happen that you would like to accomplish. So there's a fair amount of evidence to show that DIP and DAP have different outcomes for children. I also did put up for you an article. So there were some studies from back in the day that are talked about in your chapter, but I put one of the original articles up for you to read. So there were some kids who went to appropriate versus inappropriate programs a long time ago, and they followed them for over 20 years and found pretty much the information that's on this slide, that the kids in the DAP programs did better than the kids in the DIP or direct instruction programs. But I did put that article on Canvas in the additional resources for you to take a look at. So now that we've gone through the different pieces of the DAP position statement that NAAYC created, so those core considerations, those developmental principles, and those elements of practice, I wanted to just revisit a few things because they are so critically important. Sort of pull out some things that kind of cut across the DAP book for your consideration. So one is the importance of positive teacher-child interactions. The next is the importance of playful learning. And the final is the importance of intentionality, which I've already been talking a little bit about. So that will be the next few slides. So relationships are vitally important to young children. I was mentioning trauma-informed care a minute ago, and the two critical elements of trauma-informed care are, one, making children feel safe, which we did talk about a little bit in the kinds of classrooms that we create, and that feeling of being psychologically and physically safe in the spaces that you're in. But the other critical component is building relationships, making connections with children, helping them to feel connected to you, helping children to feel connected with each other. So there is research to show that when teachers have positive, warm relationships with children, all children, every single one of them, that children do better, that they have greater academic success, that they have greater social competence, and that they have fewer behavior problems. So I think sometimes what happens is kids have behavior problems, and then we have a hard time interacting with them, and we do things that aren't real pleasant and positive interactions with the children, and then the behaviors get worse and we're not really sure why, when we should be doing the exact opposite. We should be leaning into that child. We should create warm, wonderful relationships, appreciate the things they do well, and those behavior problems will be minimized through that, not by us going in at them all the time and criticizing them over behaviors that they're demonstrating. So just a little food for thought. So there's a couple different ways that we can build relationships. It's called attunement and serve and return interactions. So attunement is just being tuned into kids, just getting to know them, getting to like them, recognizing the kid who needs a hug when they're upset versus the kid who just needs a moment to collect themselves, what kids like to do, what they don't like to do. Are they a lap sitter? Do they like to sit next to people? Are they, wanting physical touch? Are they less inclined to want that? Just really learning about each particular child and kind of what makes them tick. Another thing is called serve and return. So when children serve us something, we're going to return back. So if they hug us, hug back. If they speak to us, speak back. If they ask us a question, answer back. So I would really encourage you to watch this video. It's by the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, and it has great tips for how to engage in that kind of serve and return interaction that really helps promote relationships. So the other thing that I want you to know is that relationships are good for both preventing problems down the line. So when we have good relationships with children, they are less likely to have negative outcomes and more likely to have positive outcomes. But we can also use these kinds of relationships to fix things that are already kind of broken. So if kids have experienced trauma and they are engaging in behaviors that aren't functional, that aren't helping them to be successful, we can create relationships that can actually help repair and fix those behaviors and allow children to develop behaviors that serve them better. So again, relationships just critical. So another critical piece that I've alluded to but wanted to go into more detail on is playful learning. So I also did put an article on Canvas under the additional resources related to this that you can take a look at. But So there's different kinds of play that children can engage in. So there's child-directed and adult-directed play, and then there's also play that is initiated by the child or initiated by the adult. So let me break that down. So child-initiated means that it's something that the child wanted to do. The child said, I want to play this, I want to learn about this, versus the adult initiating, saying, today we're going to learn about this, or today I've created this activity that I think you're going to like. So that's the first piece of it. Who is starting the learning? Is it the child or the adult? The next piece is what happens after the learning begins. Is the child in charge of seeing where that activity or that play is going to go? Are they directing what happens after the initial initiation? Or is the adult directing it? The adult is saying, this is exactly how you're going to use these materials. This is exactly what you're going to do with them. This is exactly how long you're going to spend in using them. That would be adult directed versus the child saying, I'm going to determine what I'm going to do with the materials. I'm going to determine what materials I need. I'm going to determine how long I spend with those materials. That would be child directed. So you can see that we have 4 boxes. We have the first box, which is play that is completely initiated by the child and directed by the child. That's typically what we call free play. So maybe we'll put some activities out, but we don't tell the child which one to go to. We don't tell them what to do with the materials when we're there. We don't tell them how long they stay at the center. They are both deciding themselves to go use a particular material, like go hang out in the block area, and then what they do while they're there is completely up to them. So there could, though, be play that is adult initiated but is child directed. So maybe I set up a learning table and I invite each child to come at some point during the day. So unlike free play where they don't have to go to the activities that I set up, they get to choose which ones they like. This would be me saying everybody's going to take a turn at this table, and maybe it's going to be that I have eyedroppers and vinegar and baking soda and food coloring that children can explore with. So I'm inviting them over, and while they're there, using the materials in any way that they want, because once they get there, it's child directed. They get to use the materials how they want, and they get to determine how long they stay. But while they're there, I would be over there talking with them, probably trying to point out some concepts that I already had in mind, like, oh, look what happens when we put the vinegar and the baking soda, it bubbles. Look what happens when we put food coloring in, it changes colors, etc. So then we have play that was initiated by the child but got taken over by the teacher. So as an example, there is a child over, say we brought in like an old school typewriter or a keyboard, and the child is typing away on the typewriter, just making random letter marks on the paper because that's fun to do. And then an adult comes over and says, what letter is that? Tell me that letter, click that button and then tell me what letter it is. That's moved from the child just tapping keys and, watching the black ink hit the paper and make a mark that maybe they know what it is and they don't know what it is. And now the teacher is turning it into a directed lesson of their own, rather than coming over and finding out what the child is doing, what is interesting to them about that activity, and talking with them about it. It's totally okay always for teachers to talk to children and interact with them in their play, but it should be facilitating or tagging on to what the child is doing rather than taking it over and talking about what you want to talk about. And the most extreme example of this is instruction that is both initiated by the adult and directed by the adult. So you're going to sit down at your desk and I'm going to explain to you what the plus sign is, and then you are going to do a worksheet of addition that has the plus sign in it, and everyone is going to sit at the table and do this worksheet at the same time and listen to me in the same way. And when everyone is done, then we all get to get up from our desks. That would be the most strict definition of how we might factor in what adults are doing versus what children are doing. In direct instruction, children don't really have any agency in the learning. So there is data to show that free play and guided play are best. So it is totally okay for adults to initiate activities, and it's totally okay for children to initiate activities, but children should be able to direct and adults should be facilitating. So we shouldn't be directly teaching or directly telling children what to learn. We should be facilitating what they are interested in learning. And there is data to show that when we do this, that children have higher language, literacy, and mathematics abilities, and that they're more on task. So you will spend less time telling children to do their work and to stay on task if you just let them do what they want to do and hang out with them and talk with them about what they're learning and facilitate. I'm not saying don't do math and English and language and writing and all of those things. You absolutely can incorporate those into play-based activities. You just don't have to directly instruct those things. So I've talked a fair amount about intentionality already in some of the other slides in this lecture, but I did want to highlight for you, and I also put an article from NAEYC on Canvas in the additional resources for you. But there is a book if you're interested in getting, and it goes into everything that you would need to know about being an intentional teacher. But I also wanted to give you some language from NAEYC. So intentional teachers act with knowledge and purpose. So they know about children, they know about curriculum, they know about the field, they know about research and data and developmentally appropriate practice and all the things. And they use that information and that knowledge purposefully to ensure that young children acquire knowledge, skills, content, a motivation, and a desire to learn that they're going to need to be successful in life. Intentional teaching does not happen by chance. Again, it's not just throwing materials out when you walk in the morning or grabbing a book off the shelf. It's planful, thoughtful, purposeful, highly complex. Intentional teachers use their knowledge, their judgment, and their expertise to organize learning experiences for each child that's based on observation and data. When an unplanned situation arises, as it always does, so it's not being rigid, it's not having a plan and then not deviating from that plan. It is also embracing unintentional, random things that arise. So it's grabbing those teachable moments and embracing that as an opportunity to tap into what children are innately interested in and curious about. So we are both planful and we are flexible. We can roll with the moment if that seems like what children need us to be doing. So when we are intentional teachers, we do have goals in mind for children as a whole class and children individually. And as we are interacting with children in those activities that they have either initiated or are directing, we help to facilitate. We ask them questions, we talk with them about what they're doing with those goals kind of rolling around in the back of our minds. So we are focusing on all domains of development and learning. We're also focusing on all those content areas, and we're helping children to be interested in the learning process, to not be stressed out, and to retain that motivation. So intentional teachers, therefore, integrate and promote learning in all of these different things. Teaching with intentionality means understanding that how children learn is as important as what they learn. So how children learn is as important as what they learn. Children are little. They do not learn in the same way as bigger children or as adults. They learn through play, they learn through active engagement, and so that piece of it is just as important as the reading and writing and math that they're learning. It really is important that we consider how that's taking place. So to finish up in summary, developmentally appropriate practice is research-based. It is definitive in suggesting that there are particular ways of doing things that aren't best practice, but are most effective practice. So it's not saying that you have to do something a particular way, but it is saying that you should look at research and try and use research as your guide to what kinds of practices you should be engaging in with young children. So just to kind of finish up, a quote out of your textbook, actually. So by definition, developmentally appropriate practices should be effective practices To be effective, teachers must know children. They must know how to teach, and they must know what to teach. Each of these areas of knowledge must be informed by research. The following equation describes these three components of effective research-based practice. Effective practice equals knowing children plus knowing how to teach plus knowing what to teach. And so that's really the crux of what this class is about, is how do we know children, how do we know how to teach, and how do we know what to teach.